Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about X-Men Apocalypse. Now, the X-Men movie franchise has been going longer than any other comic book or superhero franchise ever has. And Bryan Singer's been a part of that longer than any director I can possibly think of at this point. As much as it's nice to look back on this franchise as the one that I can't believe they finally brought the X-Men to the big screen, and having those memories of seeing X2 and being like, I can't believe they brought Claremont to the big screen and brought the kind of X-Men, this amazing X-Men movie that I never thought was possible. X-Men Apocalypse definitely shows this franchise's age. It feels more stagnated. It doesn't feel as fun and as enjoyable. It feels like a direction of a superhero movie that happened pre the Marvel Universe, and not really in a good way, in that kind of way too many things going on type of way that they used to do with comic book movies to appeal to 1.5 million fans at once, but then in actuality appealing to no one because no one actually really liked the movie. Now, this isn't X-Men The Last Stand bad, but if I were to rank all the X-Men movies, this would probably be right next to that one. Of course, I'm not counting X-Men Origins Wolverine, which might actually be the worst one, so I guess bring in spin-offs, it would be like third to the worst or something. But it's really Bryan Singer's version of X-Men The Last Stand, which he actually did kind of help develop a little, but then left to do Superman Returns. And X-Men Apocalypse feels like the dated ideas that the X-Men franchise has been continuing on since it was developed in very much a post-Matrix world, and acting like those ideas still kind of mean something to us when you're making a superhero movie 16 years later when the cinematic landscape has completely changed. And they did kind of a bullet time type rip-off effect with Wolverine spinning around the Statue of Liberty's crown. But nothing in X-Men Apocalypse is something that we haven't seen before in other movies and other, well, a crappier X-Men movie, frankly. But did we really need a better version of the worst X-Men movie? Did we really even want that? And do we still want these kind of superhero movies where we're going from big villain, big storyline to big storyline, rather than actually building a continuity that we can all get into from a Marvel property, and probably the Marvel comic book with the biggest legacy of a ridiculous continuity that keeps ongoing and ongoing? The X-Men movies seem the least likely to ever tackle that, and they also seem to be the one franchise that's suffering from not ever getting into that and getting more up to date with what's actually going on in the current superhero movie landscape. It takes place in 1983, 10 years after the events of the last X-Men film in 1973. After the first mutant, or the mutant known for long ago, Apocalypse, has been woken up by chance when Moira McTaggart is actually looking in to try to find this kind of cult that's shaped around a legendary mutant, and because she looks into him and leaves the secret passageway open, it hits sunlight and awakens Apocalypse, and he starts his four horsemen made up of Storm, Psylocke, and Archangel, and then eventually Magneto, who has become very despondent and evil once again after his family that he has set up in Poland are murdered, and he decides to become evil once again as Charles Xavier and his new younger versions of Jean Grey and Cyclops at Xavier's school are learning their mutant powers, are suddenly thrust into this battle against Apocalypse as Mystique tries to help them with Quicksilver to hopefully stop Apocalypse from destroying the world and making a better one, as most super movie villains do. X-Men Apocalypse, at least aesthetically, feels a lot more like a Marvel movie. You have more comic book like superhero costumes. It's trying to kind of emulate the kind of thing Marvel did so well, which having very colorful superhero costumes, not doing the more muted things that these films were more known for. You couldn't do the kind of X-Men costumes that we're so used to in the comic books on the big screen because it would look goofy, and Marvel proved that to not be true, so they've had to course correct itself. This film doesn't really do it as well and doesn't really actually understand it. It isn't just that Captain America is colorful, isn't the whole reason we're seeing Civil War. And that's kind of the thing with these films, is that I like when my superheroes are at least having a fun time and they're more enjoyable. These are big blockbuster films, and although this isn't as uber serious as something like Batman vs Superman, it's kind of showing the same problems we have with these older superhero movies and the non-Marvel films, is they're just really trying to tackle too much and take on too many things, and this X-Men film definitely suffers from that. It's taking on kind of the ideas of Marvel, but not really. What works so well and so perfectly in X-Men Days of Future Past and shows kind of the great things about this X-Men franchise and that style of filmmaking that's been known from this franchise, this shows how that can really suffer, because having all these characters and having like quick references to them doesn't really work as well. It's like you almost like like want them to resonate more than they really do. And there's certain moments where you're getting like some really great character moments with Jennifer Lawrence's Mystique, or the new Jean Grey and Cyclops, or not really Nightcrawler, or like Professor X or Magneto, but you're not really getting them as much as you really like. You're not falling in love with them as an audience, and that's something these X-Men films are never really great at, because they're always kind of worrying about this whole superpower evil that's going to ruin and destroy the world. In Days of Future Past, it felt like you understood the stakes more. It felt a little more relatable. It felt more understandable. And in X-Men Apocalypse, it feels so ridiculous in what it's trying to do. You kind of can't even believe it. It's such a bloated, ridiculous blockbuster. In something like Age of Ultron, which is still a bloated, ridiculous blockbuster with a lot of characters in it, it's able to balance that a lot more, because you know they're part of a larger story and you know who these characters are, and it's all very well established. But this film doesn't really even get into that. In fact, it doesn't even take advantage of the fact that it takes place in the 80s. There's a part where they go to see Return of the Jedi. They play a few songs from 1983 or the early 80s and stuff like that. Why does this film even take place in 1983? Just because we set this precedent with First Class, and we have to keep setting this precedent for reasons that make like seriously no sense at this point? Like, why keep it around? And there wasn't a lot of things that like really justified what they were doing. They were making a big budget, big Hollywood superhero movie, and you just kind of have to go with it. And that's kind of not like what superhero movies are anymore. They're not things that are just kind of shoved into being a big blockbuster like they used to be when Bryan Singer started making X-Men films. You look at what the Marvel films do, and they're superhero movies first, blockbusters second. Civil War is definitely more of that, because it's more about the character interactions, what this fight means, having fun with these characters, having the quips. But like the end of X-Men Apocalypse, what's so different about this than like the trailers I've seen for Independence Day Resurgence, or like the ending of the crappy like The Day the Earth Stood Still or something? It just doesn't feel like there's much different or even something unique experience-wise about it. And it's a little odd that this is like the follow-up in the Fox X-Men cinematic universe almost to Deadpool, because it feels like it lives in a world way before a movie like Deadpool could have ever existed. Deadpool is about character first, and then the story is just kind of like a standard thing and stuff, but it definitely like brings through like this fun character. It got the lessons people had learned in a post-Iron Man world, and X-Men Apocalypse is still acting like the most influential superhero movies are like Sam Raimi's Spider-Man and Bryan Singer's first couple X-Men movies. And maybe it shows like the fault in Bryan Singer's direction and how he's maybe not the auteur everyone thought he was going to be. And I know like almost every review of X-Men Apocalypse has pointed out the faults in Bryan Singer's direction and brings up he's not as strong of director everyone used to think he was. And yeah, I guess that is actually true, because you look at his filmography, he got to do Superman Returns and that didn't work out, and he's never really become that substantial director we all thought he would be. And he's really relied on this franchise far more than I ever thought he would when he came into it. He's used it to kind of like give himself more of a career, which is a little sad in a way, but I think it would be nice if someone would change it up with the X-Men movies. I'm kind of honestly, this showed me like I really am sick of him at this point. Of his 4 X-Men films, this is absolutely the fucking worst. The first X-Men film definitely has its problems with it, but he was rushed into it, and it definitely feels incredibly dated, but this doesn't reach the highs he had with Days of Future Past or X2, and he knows the material very well. He knows these characters, and there's nothing really about Apocalypse that screams 80s, really. Apocalypse isn't like a time-specific villain. The way like Days of Future Past plays with time, it's very much a 70s story that worked with it, what they're doing in the 60s with the Cuban Missile Crisis and the mutants, that worked with the story they're telling. Apocalypse in the 80s, it's like, well, Apocalypse was created in the 80s, and I'm just like, sure, but what is time specific about that? What are we doing with this story? How is that a natural evolution of these characters? And instead it's just like, yeah, but Apocalypse is like on this list and you guys like him, so we didn't really think about building towards it. The X-Men movies don't have a Thanos. They're not building to a Dark Phoenix saga. They're not thinking about how we get to each movie. They're thinking about one movie at a time, and that's not really working out for the franchise as a whole. X-Men Apocalypse feels like it's a film that was written and developed in 2005, and for some reason we're getting it now, and they did kind of some modern special effects updates to it. There's nothing about the writing in this that really feels 2016 at all. It's like probably the most dated of all superhero movies I've seen this year, and I'm someone who loves the X-Men. I grew up with the X-Men, loving the X-Men, and I get excited for every X-Men movie. You know, I was kind of excited for this, even though I had heard probably wasn't going to work out for me. I still love seeing the X-Men on screen, screen, and this was really disappointing. Now, it wasn't the sobering, total awful effect that X-Men The Last Stand was. Bryan Singer has referred to the fact that this is kind of like his makeup for that. I kind of would like to stay away from doing anything like X-Men The Last Stand whatsoever, because it was an awful piece of garbage. And this is veering towards that, but it shows actually Bryan Singer probably can make a better X-Men Last Stand than Brett Ratner, but Brett Ratner's like one of the worst directors and human beings ever in human existence. So, I mean, if everyone wants to make fun of and criticize Bryan Singer, they can at least admit he's better than Brett Ratner, so that's something, I guess. Even though this film is overloaded with characters and doesn't really get to have fun with Psylocke or Storm, really, and have things with Mystique where, like, I'm like, wait, what happened to her? And then she comes back, I'm like, oh, I guess she's fine. There are too many characters, but in X-Men The Last Stand, there was like even like 20 times more the characters that are in this, and it made even less sense. So I'm glad in X-Men Apocalypse, he at least kind of condenses it and understands story and understands how to make a big movie a lot better than Brett Ratner. So it shows he's a lot more competent than that, but not competent enough to really have fun with these characters. I wish they had kind of done one of those infamous Marvel reshoots to do things to just make the characters more fun and make the film more fun, and this was like not fun at all. I really do like the new casting, and I hope this kind of does show some faith I have in the future of this franchise. I think I want the X-Men films to become something other than what the X-Men films have done before and the crappier versions of that. I'm not necessarily hating on the other X-Men films. I love X2 and Days of Future Past quite a lot, and First Class might be my favorite. Those three are kind of definitely up there, and there's certain things that are very good about them, but it does feel like more stagnated, like it's not really earning its full potential as a comic book movie, like it's always holding back. And this film still feels like that, and it's like, but you've made 9 X-Men movies. Like, why aren't we really showing the X-Men from the comic book? There's nothing holding you back anymore, and it's almost like they've gotten into the tradition of that, so they in fact are holding themselves back for some reason to recreate this thing that we don't need to do anymore. It was set up in a time when comic book movies were different, and we're still doing that. Like, what is the purpose? And I think whereas other smarter franchises have gone, well, maybe there is no purpose, so we'll move on from it. X-Men has stayed true to that this whole time. Maybe it's because of Bryan Singer's involvement has gone on far too long than it ever should have. They need to come up creatively with a different way to do these X-Men movies, because it would be fun to really get into the continuity, not be so invested in big villain to big villain to big villain, and make these event films rather than both event films that have a continuing storyline and have more continuity to them. But it doesn't feel like they're changing them anytime soon, and X-Men Apocalypse shows what's really wrong with them is that they're more interested in that big eventness of it. Although the X-Men were known for their big crossover events and things like that, I don't think X-Men Apocalypse like really shows the joy of that. It shows the problems with that style and how that style is kind of faltering and the foundation is breaking, and showing it maybe can't keep the house up as well as we once thought it could. It feels like Singer is a director of a past gone era. The focus of X-Men Apocalypse isn't necessarily to do things that feel natural to the characters the way the Marvel movies do and really understand a comic book story or story in general. It's to do all these like cute things and have certain characters, and although the Caliban cameo was nice and they have certain things that are alright, I don't entirely hate this movie. It is kind of like the more enjoyable version of X-Men Last Stand, but it's still X-Men Last Stand, which totally sucks. It feels like someone who's coming up with these older ideas that, although that worked really well, he's kind of like almost like the perfect person to make more of a talky kind of Star Trek type movie, which I honestly would love for Bryan Singer to do. But like in Days of Future Past, that works really well. But in X-Men Apocalypse, it shows how that style is not aging well. He's just always showed them this way, and so they will always be that way because that's the way we're used to it. There's too many like older signs of an older comic book movie that we need to move past. This is not the present of comic book movies, and I'm not just saying that because things have moved past it. It's just like I feel like I should demand more at this point. I feel like I should be asking for a better movie, for a shared universe with more consideration on building that shared universe, not just taking it for granted that they have this vast library of characters and stories and they can just keep hitting them and using them at will and it'll sort of work out. They're not really building to a larger story or doing anything with it, and maybe this trilogy will kind of end that kind of outdated way of doing comic books, but it's against the kind of characters they are. X-Men Apocalypse never really does a true X-Men story. They're doing Bryan Singer's X-Men, and until they can get rid of that, it will continually be a problem and an outdated way to do superhero superheroes and make me realize why Civil War was such a triumph of superhero filmmaking and see the faults in why X-Men continues to do an outdated style from 16 years ago that we really don't need anymore. So if you have seen X-Men Apocalypse and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.